Chaye Chaun, Yome Chaun, Chaye the Halbeis Israel, Bagalav is man, Kariv Imru Amen. Yehe Shmei, Rabba Mavrach, Yolam Mayo, Isparach, Vishtabach, Viswar, Visumam, Visnasei, Visadar, Visalav, Visalol, Shemei, the Kudisha, Brichu, Leilam in Kal Bichasa, Vishirasa, Vishbachasa, Venechem Asad, Amiram Yalmav, Imru Amen. Yehe Shlomo Rabba Min Shemaya, the Chaim Lane of Akal Yisrael, Imru Amen. Oseh Shalom Min Romav, Huyasa Shalom Bolenu, Akal Yisrael, the Imru Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi Schneier. It is now my pleasure to welcome the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres.
Excellencies, dear friends, we come together, albeit virtually, to commemorate the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. I'm deeply grateful to the survivors who will share their testimonies today. Auschwitz, Sobibor, Treblinka, these names have become emblematic of the unprecedented cruelty and horror of the Holocaust. Were we to observe a minute of silence for each victim, that silence would last more than 11 years. Our first task is to remember those who perish, the 6 million Jews, and also the Roma and Sinti, LGBTQI+ communities, people with disabilities, and countless others. We remember the desperate pleas of Jews and others to the international community, and the shameful silence that met these pleas. My own country, Portugal, issued a directive to its diplomats to deny safe haven to refugees. One diplomat, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, the consul in Bordeaux, chose to defy the order. Over a few days in June 1940, Sousa Mendes issued 30,000 visas, including some 10,000 to Jews, allowing them safe passage to Lisbon, where they could escape to other parts of the world. For his act of defiance, Sousa Mendes was severely punished by the Portuguese dictator of the time. Years after his death, Yad Vashem recognized Sousa Mendes, along with other courageous individuals, as the righteous among the nations. In a world of total moral collapse, their example shows that a single person of integrity can make the difference between life and death. Excellencies, the Holocaust did not happen as a lesson for humanity. As Hannah Arendt said, the Holocaust should never have happened, for we will be unable to punish it or forgive it or come to terms with it. Yet it did happen. And the phrase never again rings hollow unless we use the past to take the measure of our own time. What we see today must worry us and jolt us into action. A resurgence of Holocaust denial, attempts to rewrite history, efforts to whitewash and rehabilitate people who committed crimes against humanity. Meanwhile, survey after survey shows increasing ignorance among young people about basic facts of the Holocaust. Ignorance goes hand in hand with indifference towards intolerance. And I was shocked to learn that some people who refused the COVID-19 vaccine have appropriated the yellow star that Jews in Nazi Germany were forced to wear. Anti-Semitic attacks, both verbal and physical, have increased during the pandemic despite lockdowns and quarantines. The past year saw the emergence of anti-Semitic Zoom bombing, when bigots disrupted online gatherings hosted by Jewish institutions with anti-Semitic bile and fascist symbols. But anti-Semites don't need cutting-edge technology to spread vicious lies. They have been fueling hatred and conspiracy theories for millennia. Social and economic turbulence has always created fertile ground for their bizarre fantasies. All societies must take action to tackle anti-Semitism root and branch. In this connection, I would like to acknowledge the efforts of countries that have agreed on the common definition of anti-Semitism that I recognized at the high-level event on the power of education to counter racism and anti-Semitism in 2018. This definition states, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Historical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community, institutions, and religious facilities. It is important to be clear about what anti-Semitism is. A shared understanding can serve not only the work of the United Nations, but all global efforts to uphold human rights and human dignity. Excellencies, the United Nations must always be at the forefront of the fight against anti-Semitism and all forms of religious discrimination and racism. We must always stand on the side of the marginalized and persecuted. Anti-Semitism, virulent anti-Muslim bigotry, persecution of Christians, racism, and anti-refugee hatred are becoming normalized in a coarsening public discourse, often amplified in online echo chambers of hate. This is why I have made tackling the root causes of intolerance an urgent priority, including through the call to action for human rights, the UN strategy and plan of action on hate speech, and the UN plan to safeguard religious sites. Our United Nations Holocaust Outreach Program carries the testimonies of survivors and their relevance today around the world. The Holocaust reverberates through the United Nations at a deeper level too. We exist to prevent war, the most fertile ground for atrocities and genocide. We work to tackle poverty and inequalities, the root causes of anxiety and anger that make people susceptible to demagoguery and populism. And we strive to create a world of justice and dignity for all, the best defense against the inhumanity that reached its most horrific expression in the Holocaust. Excellencies, we should not exaggerate the echoes of the 30s, but neither should we be deaf to their eerie resonance today. We must remember how easily hate speech turns to hate crime, how societies that have no room for diversity have no room for humanity, how silence in the face of bigotry is complicity. Today and every day, let us commit never to be silent in the face of hatred and never again to allow the world to relive the horror of the Holocaust. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. It is now my honor to introduce His Excellency, Mr. Abdullah Shahid, President of the United Nations General Assembly.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to start by extending a profound welcome to the Holocaust survivors participating in the ceremony today. We can never take back what you had experienced, but we can honor you and recognize the memory of all who were lost. In doing so, we celebrate the lives and mourn the losses of more than 6 million women, men, and children who perished during the worst atrocity in human history. For the Jewish people and for all other minority groups targeted, harassed, murdered, and persecuted during the Holocaust, we stand united. It is often said that history repeats itself. Yet, in remembering, in telling this story, we help avert such repetition. We remind ourselves of humanity's worst moments and vow, year after year, never again. At the same time, we honor those whose lives were cut short by ruthless and intolerable acts fueled by bigotry, anti-Semitism, and hatred. We ensure that they live on in legacy and in memory. Because to do so is to stand against any manifestation of Holocaust denial, to refute those that seek to distort facts, and to commit to raising awareness in educating new generations. It is a commitment to uphold the truth, to embrace equality, and to protect the rights of the most vulnerable groups all around the world. It is heartbreaking that amid the scourges of this pandemic, hatred, intolerance, and anti-Semitism once again fueled modern violence, conflict, and discrimination. As a presidency of hope, my presidency, I commit to supporting and strengthening efforts at the General Assembly that protect human rights and empower people everywhere. Too much suffering and pain has been endured for the history of Holocaust to be lost through lies and hate. In memory of the Holocaust victims and out of respect for the survivors, let us never forget. Let us unite for truth, peace, and justice for all. I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, His Excellency, Mr. Gilad Erdan, Permanent Representative of Israel to the United Nations.
Secretary General Guterres, President Shahid, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, distinguished survivors and speakers, ladies and gentlemen. My grandfather, Saba Chaim, lived in Transylvania with his wife Bracha and their 8 beautiful children. They lived in a strong community and led fulfilled lives. Yet, with terrifying speed, their way of life was erased from existence. The Nazis forced Saba Chaim, Bracha, their children, and 160,000 other Jews from the region into ghettos, and soon after onto cattle cars hurtling toward Auschwitz. Immediately upon arrival, my grandfather's family was torn from his arms. Bracha and their 7 children, their innocent children, were sent directly to the gas chambers. Young children, babies, sentenced to death for the crime of being born Jewish. My grandfather and his eldest daughter, Hannah, were left alive for the sole purpose of doing back-breaking labor for the despicable Nazi regime. Following the liberation of the camp, Saba Chaim married my grandmother Rachel, who also survived Auschwitz after terrible suffering. Together, they escaped Europe and came to Israel, the Jewish homeland, to rebuild their lives. The state of Israel rose up from the ashes of humanity's darkest moment and never again is woven into its very ethos. But the Jewish state is not a result of the Holocaust, rather the living promise that such atrocities will never happen again. Never again is not just a phrase that we say. Never again is a vow to ensure that history does not repeat itself anywhere. It is a vow to take action. Last week, the General Assembly adopted our initiative to effectively fight Holocaust denial, and following our discussions with Secretary General Guterres, I was pleased to hear him today adopting and applying the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism in the UN bodies. Making sure that the UN is taking these historic steps to fight anti-Semitism has been my top priority, yet there is still much more to be done. Just last week in Texas, we witnessed another horrific anti-Semitic attack. Jewish worshippers were taken hostage during Sabbath prayers. Tragically, Jews can no longer pray in safety in synagogues around the world. If immediate action is not taken by world leaders, another unspeakable tragedy is bound to occur. On this important day, the international community must recommit itself to this critical effort. The vow of never again is a vow to take action. And the time to act is now. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is now my pleasure to introduce Her Excellency, Ms. Linda Thomas Greenfield, Permanent Representative of the United States to the United Nations.
Thank you, Undersecretary General Fleming, for that introduction. Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President, we gather on this solemn day to honor the memory of the millions of Jews and others who perished during the Holocaust. The theme for this year, Memory, Dignity, and Justice, is most appropriate. The act of remembering is our solemn obligation to those who perished, and it must never become a passive activity. A few months ago, I had the great honor of rekindling the eternal flame in the Hall of Remembrance at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. The flame illuminated a crypt filled with the ashes of Holocaust victims brought to Israel from extermination camps across Europe. It was a heart-wrenching but powerful moment, symbolizing our commitment to ensuring the memory of those killed and lessons of the Holocaust continue to live on and are never forgotten. This is one reason why the United States was proud to co-sponsor the resolution put forward by Israel and Germany to combat the scourge of Holocaust denial. Unfortunately, we have more work to do. Right now, anti-Semitism is again on the rise, and we must act to root it out in our communities, in our countries, and in our institutions. Today and in the future, let us recommit to confronting and countering anti-Semitism and other hate in all of its forms. We must also act with urgency to support Holocaust survivors who are leaving us every day. Countries where the Holocaust occurred and where the Nazis plundered and stole have an obligation to ensure that Holocaust survivors and their heirs receive justice through restitution and compensation. Those countries that haven't completed this work must do so before time runs out. All survivors of the Nazi regime should be able to live out their remaining days in dignity, security, and comfort. And all nations have some influence and leverage they can put to use toward these ends. We must be champions of justice for Holocaust survivors and their heirs. We must turn remembrance into action now and in perpetuity to ensure we can continue to say, never again. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I now extend a warm welcome to Mr. Pinchas Zuckerman and Mr. Shai Wasner. Both are renowned musicians and children of Holocaust survivors. Together they will perform Bersus Serverundit by Paul Benheim.